the question that I've been asking myself for about 10 years and feel like I finally made some progress on in the past 2 years is, who are my reference points? And I think, to be honest with myself, for too long, my reference points, even if I said I was organizing with everyday working class people, I was thinking about, like, are my super woke friends retweeting my stuff on Twitter and liking my Facebook status?
I had the privilege this month of reading Jonathan's book, and like any good organizer, I read most of it over the weekend, right before today. But I highly recommend it, and I'm going to walk you through it in our conversation tonight, and I'm pretty sure you'll be able to pick up the book somewhere off to the side after the event. So, your book is interesting because it weaves together stories and theory throughout the entire book. And most of those stories are actually your own stories and your own experiences organizing. And I definitely related to them because you didn't grow up in a big city, and it didn't sound like you grew up with a political family either. And yet you found yourself organizing in a political space. And coming from potentially a more normal life, and being grounded in a different experience than a political upbringing would give you, it seems to have really informed your organizing and your critique of organizing. So I thought tonight we could start from the beginning, and you could tell us about a little town called Bird in Hand in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, and tell us how you got political.
Yeah. Thank you. And thanks to everyone who came out tonight, and thanks to the library for hosting this event. I'm really happy to be here. I'd like to come back to Toronto someday to see it when it's maybe warmer. So yeah, I'm from actually outside of the little town of Bird in Hand, which is, when I grew up, a town of maybe about 1,000 people, I think less. And I grew up on a farm. We were not farmers, but an Amish family farmed, and we lived in the farmhouse. And I grew up Mennonite, pretty conservative, apolitical. Life revolved around church. I went to Mennonite school, working class, and very socially conservative. So I'm not a very likely suspect for being in a space like this and writing a book like the one that I wrote, and spending my full adult life pretty submerged in the American left. So folks have asked me this question a lot. Well, how did you become political? And the short answer is there were two things that happened at once. There was racism at my high school, and it really upset me, and I started to see how it was a structural problem because of the way the administration handled the racism at the school. So I might have not had the tools to think of it as a structural problem, but to think of it as these people's bad attitudes toward these people. But the way the administration kind of turned a blind eye to it really helped me understand the political nature of it. And then at the same time, actually through Christianity, I was given Bible verses my whole life to read in Mennonite church, and then I decided to read the Bible myself when I was 15, and so much of it had to do with social and economic justice. And I was like, what? Why wasn't I taught this? And so that led me to all these questions about economics, and I started just doing research on my own. I was failing out of school. I was a really terrible student, but I was going to Mennonite Central Committee's Alternative Resource Library. I came upon like Multinational Monitor, New Internationalist, The Catholic Worker, and that began my deep dive. Those are the specifics, but like really what it boils down to is it was a series of accidents, and that has always sat with me, that because there's not a lot of people from my background that end up deep within the left over the past 50 years. And it's always sat with me that it's kind of random that I have, and that there are a lot more people in areas like where I'm from who share some of the dispositions and values, but didn't have those series of accidents to kind of give them the opportunity. And later in life, I've looked at social movement theory, and one of the most basic yet profound things that a lot of social movement theorists have landed on is the biggest determination of whether people act on politically is not their political disposition, but it's, are they provided an opportunity to act by somebody in their social orbit? And so that's really sat with me, and that's part of how later I kind of had this break. I dove deep, headlong into social movements, and I think in my youth had much more of a chameleon personality and fit in really quickly. And but then I just had this thing bothering me of we're kind of talking to ourselves here, and this thing that you're saying in a certain way, maybe if you said it a little bit differently, people where I'm from would be able to hear it. And I started to pick that apart. Why are we so insular? Why are we talking to ourselves so much? And that's how I started Beyond the Choir, which you probably have the same phrase in Canada, preaching to the choir. Yeah. And that's part of what we've done. And we've looked into some of the structural causes over the past 50 years of why the left has become so insular, at least in the United States. I don't want to speak for Canada.
So before we get into some of the criticisms of movements that you've been a part of and some of the lessons you've pulled out of that, let's talk first about your experience in the Occupy movement and Occupy Wall Street. You went deep into it, and you talk a lot about that in the book. It's woven through different chapters. And one of the first things that you talk about is something that they maybe did right, which was the use of the 99%. Some people are critical of that because they think that it created a false unity. It brought together some people that maybe shouldn't be brought together. But you describe it as a power move. Can you elaborate a bit on that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I am interested in contesting concentrated power, and to do that, you need to build power. And so I think there is an analytical critique of the framework of the 99%. Well, that's absurdly broad. It obfuscates, fractures within the 99%. It, where is race in the 99%? Where's gender in the 99%? What about the class disparities, even when you're talking about class within that 99%? This is an absurdly broad category. How does this have any intellectual integrity as a concept? That's all true analytically, but misses that this "we are the 99% was a hegemonic move. It was a power move that in the United States, for 30 years, the common sense was greed is good, bootstraps. There was no popular polarization on class. And We Are the 99% did that and put bankers and Wall Street and the 1% and the billionaire class on the defensive. So I think in the United States, at least, we've become so used to not having power that we become more attached to thinking that our work is to critique power from the sidelines with the most precise analysis that we can come up with. And we miss how power operates and how broad unification is important for power. And I think Occupy Wall Street did that amazingly, changed the narrative overnight. And I think we're still living in that reframe that Occupy did in the United States. We still have a lot of power building in order to make any policy gains on that. But I do think it was important. The last thing I'll say on it is I don't think that kind of unification is problem-free. And I don't think that uniting in the name of the 99% means that particular communities within that should shut up about their particular issues. No, that's not how alignments work. You still have to advocate for racial justice. You still have to advocate for indigenous rights, for women's rights. But we need a popular framework at the same time to contest the dominant culture in order for any of those movements to make gains.
And the popularity of the Occupy movement definitely made its way into Canada, and we had people occupying land in Toronto, and it lived through, I believe, if I remember correctly, it lived through the winter here in Toronto. But as it sort of fell away in the States, it also fell a bit in Canada. And you attribute that in your book to something that you talk about with a lot of other movements, and something that I've seen and experienced myself, which is this insularity that gets created with groups, where it's as if nobody is good enough or pure enough or can be trusted to enter that space because they don't believe exactly what you believe, or even this idea that winning must mean that you're doing something wrong, because if you're winning, then there's too many people who agree with you, so you're not being critical enough, right? And so when you talk about that, you talk about that as the life of the group and the political identity paradox, where we have to both, in movements, we do have to bond, we do have to come together and create spaces where people feel comfortable and where people feel safe because they share political beliefs and values with each other, and where they feel welcome and they want to come back. But we have to make sure that we don't go too far and create a space that makes it uncomfortable for somebody new to enter into. So there's this constant tension between bonding and bridging. And I was hoping that you could talk a little bit more about that, how you saw that playing out in the Occupy movement, or even one of the stories that you bring up is simply a story of a woman who's trying to get a permit, or suggesting that there be a permit for a rally. And she's basically shunned in this group that she's a part of.
Yeah. So first, the disclaimer I would give about Occupy, about critiquing Occupy in this way, is that I think all movements go through phases, and the point isn't for the movement to last forever. The point is for it to accomplish things. And so I think the things that Occupy, I would have liked to have seen it accomplish more and make some transitions in terms of organizing, but I don't think the point is inevitably like it should have just lasted forever, or especially I don't think the occupation should have lasted forever. I think that they had a limited utility politically. But, look, we live in a society that I think that there is a crisis of community in advanced capitalist countries. I definitely feel it in the United States, where and I talk about this some in the book, where kind of riffing off of some of Habermas's frameworks, that the logics of bureaucracy, the logics of profit have really colonized like every aspect of life, and we long for spaces where the logic is of mutual aid and solidarity and community and belonging, and we want that really bad, and we should have that. And what happens is a space like Zuccotti Park comes to symbolize that space for us, right? And it becomes utopian in the sense of finding that beloved community right now. And that's great. That kind of camaraderie is the lifeblood of social movements. It's deeply motivational. It makes people willing to take risks, risk arrest, put in long hours. That's the lifeblood of social movements. The problem is it can become its own prize. So maintaining Zuccotti Park as a liberatory space can become more important than what Occupy Wall Street accomplishes as a political vehicle, intervening in this whole situation where capital has consolidated power over our economic and political system. And people lose sight of that. And what also happens with that, and I think you mentioned the political identity paradox, is people start to get kind of turfy and territorial, and social movements have to grow, right? And instead you had people at Occupy Wall Street being like, well, I'm a day oneer, meaning I was here on day one, and kind of using that as a bludgeon against people who have joined later. Or people saying things like, well, where were you when X happened? Like, why are you here now? It's like, be glad they're here now. Movements are supposed to grow. But you have this mentality emerging, and that definitely happened within Occupy in a pretty dysfunctional way, as I think it has in a lot of movements. And yeah.
So in movements, or I think in some of the campaigns that we've all worked on, or even speaking from personal experience, like when I am drafting a series of tweets or a flyer or a poster or something that an organization or a campaign that I'm working on needs to put out, I can constantly hear, and I said this to you, I can constantly hear the voices of the people that you might describe as the self-righteous few. And I strip away the more accessible language that I might be able to put something into and start to use the terms that I think another group that might not actually have a lot of power underneath them in terms of people would prefer me to say, because I feel constrained by them, or I'm in meetings with them and they're fine-tuning everything that we're working on. I was hoping you could enlighten us with some solutions.
Mm-hmm.
So if we're in meetings with people who want us to say everything perfectly and who believe that our role is to be the critic and maybe not to be the winner, what is it that we get them to do, or what is it that we as a group can do to kind of move beyond that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think what this isn't about is not picking bold fights, right? So often this is framed by more self-righteous folks as like, oh, you're watering down your message, or you're avoiding having this fight because you're spineless. And there are plenty of people that are worthy of that critique, right? There are plenty of people in politics who are watering things down and are afraid of having a strong, powerful message that cuts on social justice, economic justice issues. But as an organizer and a mobilizer, you have to talk to people where they are. You have to be able to reach people in language that means something to them. And so, for example, whether to name capitalism or socialism as terms, depends on what context you're in, right? People might say, oh, you're afraid of using this and saying what it is. Well, if the only way that those terms have been defined for people in an area where you're organizing is by the narrative of your opponents, using the term it doesn't mean that to them. You have to build up that language from the ground up. You have to reach people in values language that they can hear. So specifically, I know you're going to ask me a little bit about Lancaster, Pennsylvania later, but the past 2 years have been a huge lesson on this for me, and it boils down, and in what you were saying, the question that I've been asking myself for about 10 years and feel like I finally made some progress on in the past 2 years is, who are my reference points? And I think, to be honest with myself, for too long, my reference points, even if I said I was organizing with everyday working class people, I was thinking about, like, are my super woke friends retweeting my stuff on Twitter and liking my Facebook status? And the past 2 years, we've organized a base of over 1,000 dues-paying members in an area that's conservative, that's never had anything like this. 3/4 of our base was never involved in anything political before 2 years ago. That has become my reference point. That has become the only thing that matters to me. That's become the thing that motivates me. And I could care less if my super woke friends are liking my Facebook status, right? It doesn't matter to me, right? And that process of organizing is a pedagogical process. You can't download a radical analysis into somebody's head by spelling it out, right? Like, we know this about pedagogy. I think a lot of radicals know this about pedagogy, that you can't just download things, but then we do it anyway, and we feel like we're compromising if we don't say everything all at once. People can't hear everything all at once. Pedagogy, I think of campaigns like a pedagogical process where it's through unfolding events and through the interventions that a political organization makes in relationship to those things that creates spaces where people can develop their own analysis. I think that's what we have to do. So that's, I guess, there was one thing I wanted to land on that. You said, what are the solutions? To me, there's no magic tactic in this, except there kind of is. And that is, door-to-door canvassing is a really special tactic. I'm sure there are other tactics like this, but door-to-door canvassing, and we've done so much of it in the past 2 years in Pennsylvania, it forces your core folks to be in interaction with the periphery, with a broader base, with the folks that you want to organize. And so it's a check on the rhetoric that people are using. Some of the stuff that we use in our super left circles just doesn't fly at the door. And if you keep saying it, you're just going to think that the whole world is backward, or you're going to shift and be like, okay, how can I say this in a way that is a productive conversation? How can I listen to this person and learn something from them? And so that tactic in particular has been really helpful in orienting our leadership to the base that we want to be organizing.
Mm-hmm. And so we're talking about organizing, we're talking about building a base, and I think, and bringing new people in, and that is really premised on the idea of building power and growing a movement so that you can win. Mm-hmm. And it's this idea that you talk about the left needing to take responsibility and to strive to actually hold power. Mm-hmm. Now, I've done organizing in movements. I've worked for a politician. I run a nonprofit now. But it was in the NDP leadership campaign that I first came to understand that there are these different, even within a political party in Canada, there is a segment of people that don't necessarily think it's that political party's job. So they're inside a political, like a partisan political institution, and they don't necessarily think it's the party's job to win, to govern. Now there's a whole other group within that party that absolutely wants to win and to govern. But I could see exactly what you're talking about living in Canada, and I'm sure it's the same within movements. So do you want to talk just a little bit more about the significance of winning and why when we are protesting or rallying, our ultimate goal should be to actually take power?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think to me, where I've come to why we need to take power is because we want to win specific things for specific people, including ourselves. And so if we abdicate the space of power, the people who are power hungry and have a very different agenda will gladly seize that space. So, in the United States over the past 40, 50 years, there's been a huge chasm between outsider movements and community organizing and electoral politics, capital P politics, right? And I think that has been to the advantage of Wall Street. That's been to the advantage of the people who have enormous power in our society. And I think power is complicated, and it can live a lot of different places. So I think that there is a role for outsider movements to build independent political power that can pressure the people in government. But I think, I've been much more in outsider movements in my life than I have been. I'm really just getting my feet wet with electoral politics. And fundamentally, I think all politics is cut from the same cloth. And it's delusional. And I have had this delusion, and so I'll speak for myself. I think it was delusional when I had this, to think that when I was doing direct action, that it was more pure and outside of it, and just kind of this independent thing that was clean of the mess of politics. Because our goal ultimately was to pressure people in power, and we wanted to win. And what does that winning look like? It's consolidated through legislation, through structural changes, through changes in the economy, and that's what we want. And so I've come to embrace that that's what we want, and that is messy, right? So I'm not at all arguing that take power because it's problem free, and that's never gone wrong, right? Obviously, there's a lot of reason looking back on the last 100 years to be wary of what power can do to movements, what power can do to parties, to individuals. And that's why I think it's so important for there to be a continual process of bringing more people, more voices, expanding the polity, expanding who is placing demands on the political system. And I think it matters a great deal who is in office. I mean, in the United States, there's been, we see the worst case scenario right now, hopefully. We said that during the Bush years too. But you've had times when there have been major pushes forward, the New Deal, for all its faults, secured some pretty important things. The 5 different civil rights legislation bills that were passed. And in all of those situations, you had the combination of really strong outside movements and a critical mass of allies within the political system. And at different times, we've had one or the other, and it's never amounted to change. In fact, in those other situations, the right has continued to gain. So with Obama, you had a trifecta of Democrats running both houses and the presidency, but you didn't have, it was a historically weak time for social movements until the later half of the Obama administration. And we didn't have any of the kind of bold changes that many of us had hoped for. So yeah, I think this is what we're trying to do. We're not trying to be the right. I don't want to be like, the righteous person holding a candle in the wind on a ship that's sinking. I want to rest the helm.
Mm-hmm. And speaking of the U.S., what goes without saying, there's been a rise of right-wing populism in the United States. We're feeling it here in Canada and uniquely in Ontario at the moment with our own version of Trump, Doug Ford, who I hope you had the opportunity to witness in some way over the last couple days here as he capped and cut public education and increased the class sizes for elementary schools and did many, many other things just in the last couple days. With that, there's this ongoing conversation about whether or not the left should engage in populism. And you talked on the weekend at Democracy Exchange about this kind of progressive version or inclusive populism versus a right-wing kind of reactionary populism. So I'm hoping you can tell us a little bit more about that, where you think we should go, but then also whether or not you think we have built, and you can speak about this from the American context, but whether the vehicle for change exists, whether there's enough people trained up to knock on doors, enough leaders, enough organizers to actually go out and build, even if we won the communications side of it.
Yeah. So the term populism is a very contested term. So I am not going to claim to have the definition of populism, but in the definition of populism that I use, populism, one, I think we have to understand that we're living in, again, this is my not original definition of populism. I think this is shared more with like Laclau and Mouffe, if you want to read more. But we have to understand that we're living in a populist moment or a populist landscape. And what that means basically is that we're facing a crisis of legitimacy. And this is advanced capitalist countries all over the world, and not basically every government that's gone along with the neoliberal agenda for the past 4 or 5 decades is facing I think we're in a crisis of legitimacy where political authority has lost credibility with a critical mass of the populace. And so what you see in times like that is a resurgence of social movements on both the left and the right. And what happens is they become more resonant because the dominant narrative that explains why power is structured and wealth is structured the way it is starts to lose resonance. And so there's this opportunity to articulate a new premise for a we the people and to name new culprits. And so you saw that in the United States with the simultaneous emergence of, or close together, of the Tea Party on the right and Occupy Wall Street on the left, the Trump campaign and the Bernie Sanders campaign. And people think of these as, elites want you to think that these are just mirror images, that the populism of the right and the left are basically synonymous. And it's a funny trick that they're trying to do with that. They have a vested interest in that because both forms of populism are a threat because they want to overthrow the oligarchy, right? However, they're very, very different in their agenda. And so that is, I do have a whole slide presentation about that. It'll be in my next book. But key to right-wing populism is that they kind of obfuscate the economic power at the top and instead get you to look at the liberal elites near the top in the political class. And they like to pick on, in the United States, Hollywood, the media, and academia. And from the vantage point of the bottom, it looks like the top. And unfortunately, a lot of liberals are really condescending, and so they play right into the caricature. And we have, presidential candidates who say things like "basket of deplorables," and shockingly lose to a populist. And then right-wing populists also importantly punch down at immigrants, at Muslims, at you name the demographic, and they form a solidarity that is exclusionary against an other. But what we have to do is also punch up, and the opportunity we have is to actually name clearly the economic power at the top, and it resonates with people. And the problem in the United States is we have an opposition party that hasn't been willing to name corporate power, Wall Street, consolidated wealth, as the culprit, and to pick that fight, and to stand up for working people, and demand Medicare for all, demand bold demands. And when we do that, it works. And so that's what I mean by, and then we can articulate a we the people that is actually inclusionary of everyone, regardless of race, gender, country of origin. And I'm not saying that's easy, but that is what I think we need to do, is pick fights with power, name culprits. We often talk about it as, in the United States context of, we need Obama's we, because Obama was really good at articulating a story of America from the point of view of the groups that fought to become part of that we the people, abolitionists, suffragettes, etc. But he never wanted to name culprits. And we need Bernie's them. Bernie was very willing to name culprits at the top, but he wasn't very good at telling a story of America that made people feel part of it. So that's some of what I mean by what we need to do.
Let's say you get that, right?
Yeah.
So you have somebody who's articulating the we, somebody who's articulating
Like
the them.
Ocasio-Cortez.
Yeah, AOC is doing an amazing job at the moment. Do you think that you have the vehicle, that you have the infrastructure in place to actually deliver change underneath that?
No, this is my nightmare. I think we're in a race for who can gain the political momentum. I don't want to scare people, but I think the 1930s are the best corollary to the moment that we're in globally right now. It's not exactly like that, but it shows how contingent the outcomes are. In the United States, there was nearly a fascist coup. We don't talk about that very much. And FDR and the New Deal barely won. In Germany, Italy, Spain, the right barely won. And I think in moments like this, what liberals want is in the United States, they want to go back to Obama, Clinton-style democratic centrism, and they hate Trump, they're scared of Trump, and they're like, can't we just return to normal? And what they don't understand is that normal created the crisis that allowed for Trump. And if we go back to that, we might win the presidency, we might not in 2020 with a centrist candidate, but there's a whole new wave of authoritarian populists who understand the playbook, who don't have the baggage of Trump. Whoever gains that momentum is going to be the driver of history for the next 10, 20, 30 years. And so I think there's a race against time with infrastructure. I think the biggest thing that we could do to get ahead and to gain that momentum in the United States is to have 30 or 40 Ocasio-style candidates in House races in 2020. And that's what I'm working desperately to do. I think the presidential candidate matters a great deal too, but you could potentially lose out on that, but still gain the momentum by driving it in that way. And it's hard because we don't have a bench. We're at the tail end of a 40-year period of decline of infrastructure. We don't have a bench of people who know how to run for office, people who know how to campaign, and we have to build that up with every cycle, and we have to build it as fast as we possibly can.
And it sounds like, because I did talk to you about the candidate recruitment side of it when we chatted on Friday, and you talked about where you were getting those candidates from as well. So it's not just the white privileged man generally who's just ready to run that you're picking. Right. You're talking to people who are a part of social movements or who are a part of their communities, and that's huge. And then hopefully underneath them is an infrastructure that would actually fuel what we would call a ground game, like people to canvass, to knock on doors, and to pull more people in.